Hi, everyone, and welcome to Attentive Healthcare Solutions webinar, Deep Dive into the NextGen Transaction Approval process. My name is Chelsea Grover, and I'm the Marketing Communications Coordinator for Attentive. Before we dive into today's webinar, I wanted to take a moment to explain the process for today's presentation. First, I'd like to mention that this webinar will be recorded. We'll send out a copy of the slides and the recording within the next week. Next, for those of you who aren't familiar with Attentive, I wanted to share a bit of who we are with you. We specialize specifically in next-gen healthcare, and we're passionate about providing solutions for our healthcare provider partners, which in turn help them to improve patient care, enhance the patient experience, and maintain a financially healthy practice. To sum it up, we do everything next-gen. And we also have some add-on productivity solutions for next-gen, including ChartGuard and Refund Manager. Next, I wanted to mention an upcoming webinar that we'll be presenting on June 10th. We'll be covering locking down your next-gen system from the inside out. In it, we're going to cover different topics, including different ways to lock down your system from the inside out, limit access without making separate practices, lock down by patients, templates, documents, stuff like that. And on July 15th, we'll be covering regulatory changes to be aware of for 2020 and beyond. 2021 and beyond, I don't know, one of the two. 2021 and beyond, sorry about that, my screen was blocked. So keep your eyes out for an invite to those webinars, and we hope to see you there. So back to today's webinar on understanding the NextGen Transaction Approval process. At the end of the presentation, we'll open the floor up to questions from you. We'll answer all the questions at the end, but you may type them in the questions area of the webinar control panel whenever they occur to you. And finally, for audio clarity purposes, everyone's phone will remain muted throughout the entire webinar. If you experience audio issues, please use the chat box to let us know so we can resolve them. And again, questions may be entered in the questions box. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Dottie Pinnock is Managing Consultant, and Lindsay Lanning is Manager of Client Development at Attentive. I'm sure that you all know the name Dottie Pinnock. We are delighted that she's going to be presenting on this, and she truly is the subject matter expert on this. So Dottie, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to you.
Thanks, Chelsea. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Mastering the Transaction Approval Queue Functionality. I see a lot of new names, a couple of ones that I'm familiar with, so we appreciate everyone attending today. I know this is a crazy time for everyone, and we value everyone's time. Now, I'm sure some of you got the invite and wondered what the heck this is, or maybe some of you thought you might benefit from expanding what you're already doing in your practice. We chose this topic because we found that many of our clients just don't use the functionality or don't even really understand, don't even know it exists. They've never really worked with it before. So we chose a topic that we thought might be interesting. And I'm going to do my very best to give you a soup to nuts, top to bottom, everything you need to know, and leave you with some resource material as well. So we think this will add value to your revenue cycle process, and we're doing it because our ultimate goal is to help you maintain a financially healthy practice and continue to provide high quality care to your patients. So what is the transaction approval queue? Well, the transaction approval queue is fundamentally an accounting control mechanism. It's designed to help you monitor specific financial activity in your practice, and it provides a system, an automated system, automagic, as I like to say, system, to ensure that certain transactions are reviewed and approved prior to posting them into your system. To summarize, it basically allows each practice to determine thresholds for each type of transaction that can be added by staff members without authorization. Remember, it's the total transaction that has to be used for meeting the qualified criteria, not just the line item, but the total transaction. For example, adjustments greater than $100, you may want to have those, like if you're doing certain types of adjustments, maybe small balance write-offs, maybe cash discounts, maybe courtesy. For example, over $100, you may want to require a supervisor approval. But adjustments more than $500, you may want to have certain levels of approval. And those are kind of the examples we're going to walk through today. So maybe if it's $500 or more, you want to get the supervisor to look at it, then get the manager to approve it, and then maybe have even more people approve it, because you're allowed to have up to 10 people in the approval queue. As you'll see, these transactions can be restricted not only by dollar value, but also by the transaction code, which is going to allow you to have maximum flexibility to comply with your internal policies and procedures. And typical of many other NextGen features, it's totally customizable, and that's what we're going to walk through. So let's start with some questions. As I mentioned earlier, it can be configured to meet your needs. But first, your practice has to answer the questions. What kind of transactions are you going to require to have approval? Are you going to require adjustments, payments, refunds? What dollar amounts are going to justify or require approval? Who's going to do the approving? How's it going to work? How's the whole thing going to work? Once it's approved, do you want it, before it gets approved, do you want it to be held? All of these are the kind of things you have to figure out before we get started, so that you have kind of an idea of exactly how you want this to work. And then what kind of reporting are you going to need, and what kind of reporting is available in the system to comply and get you started. So once you get the basic questions answered, we can start setting up the transaction approvals in the application file, in the file maintenance application. And the first step is setting up the approvals and who's going to do the approvals. One thing about this functionality is that it is practice level. So if you've got multiple practices, it's going to have to be set up separately in each practice. So the transaction approval is in the file maintenance in the practice level section. Here's a couple of examples of how you can set it up. As shown in these two examples, you can configure one approver or multiple levels of approvers. And the order that you enter them in is extremely important because it determines the progression. So in my first example, there's only one approver of everything. Doesn't really matter. In my second example, the task would first go to Lindsay, then to Lexi, and then finally to me. And this is designed for maximum flexibility. For example, Lindsay might be the AR manager who you'd want to look it over first, then maybe send it to the practice manager, and then finally even to the doctor or the administrator if it's a high enough level. Whether or not you use multiple levels of approval, whoever is the highest level of approver, they can skip over everybody and just approve it, or they can wait for it to walk through the process and get to them for their approval. And again, as with so much in NextGen, it can be extremely complicated. You can set this up to be really, really challenging and complicated, but it doesn't really have to be. You can just set up one approver for all locations like I've done here. Now, what you can do if that doesn't meet your needs, and I understand that it doesn't meet everybody's needs, is that you can set up different approvers based on the service location, right? So if you have if you need that kind of granularity, and if you have a practice that maybe has different site managers that you want to be involved in the operation, you can pick and choose which locations get assigned to which sites. And if that's something that you want to do, you would just pick the service locations for that person and then add another level for the next locations for that person, not another level, but another set of approvers for the other service locations. NextGen has a built-in safeguard that doesn't allow you to pick two locations for different approvers. So when you're adding lines here, again, you can just right-click and select all the locations. If you do that, if you decide to keep it really simple and select all the locations, you're going to want to deselect the first line. And the reason you have to do that is the first line, if you notice, it says all account budget and invoice. That has to go to a separate approver. It can be the same person, but it has to go to a separate approval line because it's kind of complicated, but if you know NextGen, it really kind of does make sense. Encounter-based transactions have one service location. So every encounter can, now charges can have multiple service locations, but remember, these are encounter-based. So your encounter level transactions will only have one service location. But the other option for account, invoice, and budget, you can have multiple service locations on an account, on a budget, or on an invoice. So that's why they can only have, they have to have a separate line, and they can't be included with all those service locations. So it would look kind of like I showed you on the prior slide here, where you've got one for all, which is just the account, budget, and invoice, and then one for each individual location. That's what your approval profile would look like if you're keeping it simple to have one approver or one set of approvers per location. So this is where you're going to add that additional line. And once you've selected the all account, invoice, or budget, you'll see that it grays out all the service locations. So you can't accidentally commingle them. I'm not really sure why they create it like that, but that's kind of how it works. And then I'll show you later in the presentation where this gets attached at the practice level, because again, it can span multiple locations. So this is going to get attached at the practice level in a few slides. If you opt to have emails sent to the approvers, the system will generate external emails. Now, approval emails to me are a little bit confusing. Basically, if you've opted in your setup to allow an external or an Outlook email to be sent, then you right-click on the name of the approver and put their email address in to the system here. And I can't tell you why the system works the way it does. I can only tell you these emails go to the approvers. So this is gonna, and I'll show you an example of the email that the approver will get when we walk through the process once we've got it all set up. But this is where you're gonna tell the system what email to send to the approver. It's worth pointing out here that it's a little bit strange the way it works, but the functionality does work very well for situations where users don't really use the NextGen system that much. Maybe they only use the transaction approval queue. So you then have to configure the email, and this is very similar to the BBP. So maybe your IT department or whoever works with your BBP, the exact configuration that you use in the BBP is typically going to work here. I often recommend that you use a different from address so that you can differentiate BBP notifications for transaction notifications. So now that we've got the question of who's going to do the approval answered, I'm going to show you how to actually set up the transactions and set up the task and decide which transactions are going to qualify for the approval. So here are some examples of approval tasks that are pretty commonly used when I set people up, the ones with the asterisks. They may not fit into your particular needs, but at least it gives you some options and sort of an idea. Typically, when I name the task, I go ahead and just put sort of what exactly the task is. So you can see I've got them for adjustments 100 to 499, 500 and up. I've got positive payment approvals, positive refund approvals, and then just regular refund approvals for amounts over $500. These are just the examples that I used in the last client that I worked with, and hopefully they're examples that you'll find useful. So again, you create your transaction type. So your source type on the task is going to be transaction. And now you're going to get an option here to pick adjustments, payments, or refunds. So then once you've decided, you put your green check, whether it's going to be a payment and adjustment or a refund. You're going to figure out who the task gets assigned to. Well, unlike the other task, like you might be using tasking for AR or for appointments or for eligibility, there's a lot of other things you can use tasking for. But one of the things that's different is when you pick the source type of transaction, you get the option to assign the task to the person that created the transaction. And it's an important distinction. This assigns the task, not the approval for who's going to approve the task, but the task itself to the person who actually created the original transaction. And it's an important distinction because it's designed to allow the person who put the transaction in to track it through and to be the one who gets notified if the task does not get, if the transaction does not get approved. So whoever you pick here as the assigned to is that person that will be notified if the approval is denied. Now, if you want that person to get an email, and this is where I said emails work a little bit weird in transaction approvals, but the task assigned to person, their email address gets added in system admin under their user profile. So if I am the person who creates the transaction and the approval is denied, it will look in system admin and get my email address from there and send me an email telling me that it has been denied. So again, it's a little bit weird how it works, but I just want everybody to understand so there's no confusion. To activate the task, like all things NextGen, well, first you assign who's going to be doing the approval. So I assigned it an approval profile. And if you notice right next to that, it's going to say that it gets created, the task gets processed immediately. So the minute that I hit the word save on the transaction, it's automatically going to create a task. So it doesn't wait for the batch to get posted. It doesn't wait for anything. Any transaction that's entered that requires an approval, the minute that transaction is saved, that's the minute the task is created. So now let's look at the transaction parameters. So you have to determine your approval amounts, like, so is it 100, in my example, as you can see, it's 100 to 499. The transaction codes that are going to be subject to approval. So for example, if it's a Blue Cross adjustment, you may only want to approve a Blue Cross adjustment over $1,000. You may not want to have to approve every Blue Cross adjustment over $100, but you may have a threshold for payer adjustments, but then have a totally different threshold for transaction codes like cash discounts, charge discounts, courtesy adjustments, things I've shown you here in this example. And then what statuses, obviously, you have to determine. Now, the next thing, and this gets a little bit complicated, but I'm going to try my best to simplify it. Parameter 8 just says, if there's a transaction pending approval, do you want me to hold the patient's statement until it gets approved? So don't send that patient a statement while things are still in limbo, and you can select that. Parameter 6 and 7, I'm going to give you a chart that helps you understand those a little bit better. So place the batch on hold and carve out the transaction into a separate batch. Most of the time, you would select yes to both of those. But some of you may not want to hold up the whole batch being processed. Some of you may want to use this as more informational, where you would not put the batch on hold and you wouldn't carve it out. You just let it go ahead and post. And then if it doesn't get approved, you can go back and deal with it later. It's really again, NextGen has so many options that sometimes it can be very, sometimes it's too much, sometimes it's not enough. It just depends on the needs of your organization. But to try and make this simple, I gave you a chart that will show you if you pick yes, yes, no, no, or any of the other options. And again, the no yes condition is not, it should not even be allowed. There's no reason if you're going to put the batch on hold and not carve it out to a separate batch. So if you are going to place it on hold, it's going to carve that out into a separate batch. Unless you put the whole batch on hold. So this is an example of, remember I showed you some examples and I said that I had an example of a positive payment approval, because sometimes when people are using these transaction approval queues, they forget that you can do a negative payment. So if, and I tried to give you the screenshots to kind of explain it to you. In this example, I use negative numbers because the transaction allows the sign to be overridden. And I know debits and credits and positives and negatives when it comes to this get a lot of people confused, and I'm not trying to do that. But if a negative payment is used, it would actually increase the balance. So there's some examples where you might do that. One example might be a refund that you have to do with a credit card. Like if you have to void a credit card, you'd have to use a positive payment instead of what would normally, or you'd have to use a reverse sign on a payment. And again, I know this gets confusing and I'm not trying to be confusing, but if you allow sign override, then when you set up your task parameters, you're going to want to use those negative numbers so that it looks for that overridden sign in whatever value to generate the task. The other thing I want to talk about is the autocomplete functionality. So if you want the system to work the way it's designed, which is to automatically manage this process for you, it's really important that you pick all 4 of these autocomplete actions, because the approval task cannot be manually completed. So approval tasks work very differently because they are, in fact, an accounting control. So it doesn't just let people go in and delete the tasks so that the person doesn't even know that there was an approval out there. So because they can't manually be deleted or completed, it's important that you make sure you allow the automation to work the way it's designed. And you have to have everything done, because otherwise the transactions won't move between the batches. And I know it's kind of a chicken and an egg thing. I'm showing you how to set it up without really showing you how it works. And sometimes I wonder if I should show you how it works and then show you how to set it up. But trust me when I tell you that it's really important that all 4 of these are selected, and you'll see that as we walk through the demonstration. As with most functions, there are specific security items that make this work. Transaction codes, transaction approvals are no different. So for the sake of completeness and to kind of give you some reference material, I just walked through the NextGen documentation and I gave you what they said the best practice recommendations are for the approvers, and then likewise for the non-management staff who will be generating the transactions. Now, there are more task-related securities, such as transferring tasks, that you may want to consider, but what I've given you here is the fundamental thing that you need to get started. As you know, if you've been a NextGen user very long, there's so many preferences that start with practice, but there's so many functionalities that start with a practice preference, and this is no different. So I want to walk you through a couple of practice preferences that are going to drive this particular functionality. First and foremost, you have to enable, by default, encounters that have a pending transaction are left out of the lookup. So if you do not have this checked in the encounters tab, then this option won't even be here, and there would not be any way at all on the lookup to be able to see any encounters that are pending approval. So you'd be looking up something and it wouldn't be there, and it'd be very confusing as to why you couldn't find it. And that's something to keep in mind, because that's going to be true even with this checkbox. You have to check it if you want encounters in an approval status. But without this preference, you don't even get the choice. The next thing that you're going to want to remember, is to attach in the task tab that approval profile that has the account. Remember the one that said all invoices, budgets, and accounts? This is where it gets attached. So that approval profile, there can only be one approval profile for that because it's attached at the practice level. The next place is then what actually turns on. It's probably the most important because this actually turns on the functionality. It is called the Enable Transaction Notes field. What it does is it creates a new field in transaction entry that gives the user a way to write a very long narrative, because in the transaction, there's a little transaction note there already, but it doesn't allow you to write a whole lot of stuff. In this transaction notes field, you can write practically a book. And it gives you a whole field that you can explain. The person putting the transaction in can explain why they want to do this write-off, or give the approver whatever information they need right at their fingertips. So once that's turned on, what you're going to see is the area in yellow is the new field that gets created in transaction entry called transaction notes. And it's not required unless the amount of the transaction qualifies for approval. And actually, and if it does, you'll get the area in red as an alert. So it'll tell you if this transaction qualifies for an approval, it's going to tell you, you have to tell the approver why you want to do this. It needs more information. And so what I do is when I'm testing this, when I'm helping a client set it up and I test it, I'll put my transaction in and save it. If I don't get this, I know that it doesn't meet my criteria. So it's also a good way to test it. I know I've done something wrong in the setup if I want it to meet my criteria and it doesn't. So once you've gotten that note, what'll happen is once you fill it in and you write something, it's going to give the user an alert that the adjustment requires approval. If it's an adjustment, if it's a payment, it'll tell you it's a payment transaction, requires an approval, and it's going to automatically be carved out into a separate batch and placed on hold. Now, the message here is going to depend on how you have it set up. But if you have it set up in the way that I kind of recommend, which is to go ahead and carve that transaction out, put the let the rest of the transactions in the batch go, but carve that out and put it on hold until it's approved, then the user will get a message telling them that that's what's going to happen. Now remember, like I told you earlier, the minute it's saved here with that note, the task is created. So if the user goes back and changes the amount, and you've got the task auto completion configuration set up, it will complete the original task. And if the new amount changes and still requires approval, it'll create a brand new transaction approval. So that's why it's so critical that you have all of those set up. So now, hopefully I've given you a little bit about how to set it all up. Now let's walk through the process of how the approvals actually get managed. So because of the flexibility in the system, the process will largely depend on the way you've configured the prior options. So for example, if you elected to send the approvers an email, that will be their notification that there's something out there. If you don't send them an email, they'll have to routinely log into NextGen and look into their approval queue to find out when they have something waiting for approval. Likewise, if you decided not to carve the batch out or put the batch on hold, you're going to have some other process to notify somebody that the transaction was not approved and needs to be reversed. So again, that's why the automation, letting the system work automatically really is the preferred way. So for the purposes of this session, let's go ahead and assume that we're sending an Outlook email to the approvers and the transactions are carved out into a hold batch. Again, this isn't the only way the system can work, but it is my recommendation. And it's the way that I've had the most success with clients using it. So all transactions that qualify to be carved out are going to be put into what's called a TRA batch or a hold batch. So again, here is what the batch posting window will look like. And the TRA batch is going to stand out in red. Once the transaction gets approved, that transaction is automatically moved into the approval batch. And you see an example of the approval batch here. Only one approval batch is created every day. So it's really important for someone not to post that batch today. Approved batches should be left alone because the system's only going to create one a day. So leave them alone until tomorrow and then post them tomorrow. What happens is when the approval batch is created, it automatically green checks it for a BBP job. So to close the loop on the automation, it's recommended that you set up a BBP job for early in the morning. So it will go ahead and post the approvals from the prior day, that approval batch from the prior day. You don't want to set the BBP job up in the afternoon after somebody's done an approval because there may be somebody else who comes in later and does another approval. The transactions in the hold batch can be deleted or modified, but not the whole batch. So you'll notice if you try to right click on the batch and do anything, open it or anything, you can't do anything to these automated batches. That again, this is a financial control mechanism in NextGen, and that's why so much of the functionality is locked down and designed to be automated so that you can't do that. Now, if you go in and delete the transaction that you've requested approval for, it'll complete the task. You still have a record of the completed task, but the user might realize that they need more documentation. There might be a lot of reasons they want to do that, but they can go in, change the amounts, or delete the transaction. So here is the email, an example of the email that will get created if you have an approval that you need to do. It'll be sent to you as based on what we looked at. It's an Outlook email. It does not contain any PHI. It gives you enough information to go into NextGen and figure out what's going on. And it gives you information about what kind of approval is being requested, but it doesn't have any PHI or anything like that on it that would you'd have to worry about. The user who got the email would log into NextGen and select the option to show the tasks in my approval queue. That one click right there and hit find. Now, for the purpose of this example, I set my work log up in a way that allows me to see all three approvers, all the columns related to the approvers. And if you're not comfortable on using the work log, we actually did a prior webinar that you might find interesting. it goes into a ton of detail about how to configure the user's work log, and the transaction approvals are no different. So you drag and drop the columns, you turn them on in your user preferences, and you get everything set up the way you want it to. And then this is what the approver would see. They would see the type of task, the amount being requested, and then again, you can drag and drop any columns you want. You could put, if it's the assigned to is the creator of the task, you could put that in there and even see who was requesting the approval right from your work log. And then you can see if you've got multiple approvers, whose queue it's in right now, and the status of the approvers before you. So managing, if you're the person getting it, the approver just double clicks into the task and they should get all the information that they need to approve the task. The additional transaction notes field is going to be shown from transaction entry, so you shouldn't have to click around a lot to see exactly what's being requested. But if you do need to, you've got the Norton button, which will take you directly to the account chart, the patient balance screen, which is great for doing these approvals because it lets you look at the whole account at sort of a glance. Or you can go directly into that transaction if you need to see it for whatever reason. The history tab, it's worth mentioning that as on all tasks, this isn't unique to transaction approvals, but all tasks have a history tab, which is going to track all the fields modified within the task, including those in the transaction approval screen. So if you can see in my example, there's been some notes, some other things done here. That's just sort of an informational thing. Once the user, so there are several options once you are in the approval queue, and I'm going to take them one at a time and just try to walk you through what the options are that I would have as the approver. If I've researched it and I'm happy with it, all I have to do is just click approved. If there are additional approvers in the profile, new levels above me that have to approve it, it moves that task into their queue and it sends that next user an email, if you've set it up that way, that they have something now that's moved from my queue into your queue. If I'm the final approver, it just auto completes the task and it moves the transaction out of the hold batch into the approved batch. The second option I have as an approver is returned. So if I pick returned, it sends it back to the person above me. Now, if there's only one approver, that's me. I don't have the option to return it anywhere. I just have, that's not going to be an option. But if there was somebody in the approval profile above me, I can pick returned, and in this example, it would send it back to Linda's queue, generate an email that something had been returned for their review before I'll approve it. The next option I have is pending, and it really does exactly what it says, nothing. It just leaves the transaction in the hold batch. It leaves the approval in my approval queue. Maybe it's pending because I've sent an email to somebody. Maybe I need to look at something. Who knows why I want to pend it, but it tells me that I've already got something going on it. I can always go into the task info and write myself a note. I can use the notes there. And in fact, if I deny the task, it actually sends me back to this screen and makes the details here required. So the denier is required to tell the person assigned to the task. So in this example, I was the transaction creator and somebody denied the approval. They have to tell me what I need to do to get this approved, or either that I need to delete this transaction because they're not going to approve it. So denied, as soon as I fill in my notes and I save it, the person that is assigned to the task, remember, not the approval, but the task, the person up here, is going to get an email if their email address is in system administrator telling me that my request was denied, and it's going to actually leave the transaction in the batch and wait for me to do something about it. The user can open the denied transaction. Remember, I told you the user could go into the batch where the transaction was, and they can make whatever change the note, write more details, change the amount. And then there's a little button right here. Sorry, I should have put a red arrow for it that says resubmit for approval. And if that is checked, then you'll get the notification that I showed you in red that says you've selected to resubmit this transaction for approval. Are you sure that's what you want to do? So once you've sent the information, now again, your original request is going to be, because you've made a change in this transaction, your original task will be completed and a new task will be generated on the resubmission when you save it. I feel like I'm throwing a lot of information at you, and I know this is not that easy. I'm not trying to make it sound complicated. I'm just really trying to be thorough so you fully understand the functionality. To ensure the financial integrity, when you've got transactions on hold, there are some system imposed restrictions. The first one are in charge entry. You'll see the little red stamp telling you that there's something, there's a transaction that's pending approval. And what it does is it blocks you from adding new charges to that encounter or modifying the charges, except for the things that I've listed here. So your modifications to the charge are restricted, and the ability to add new charges to the encounter is also restricted. You also can't pre-list it for bad debt if there's a transaction approval pending. And remember, depending on your practice preferences, you might not even be able to see this encounter in the lookup. As I showed you earlier, you have to be able to, if you don't have that option selected and you aren't looking for pending transactions, it won't even be available. And with most things, NextGen, there are the ability to do reports. So there is pretty good reporting, tracking activity related to this functionality. And I didn't go into the details in this webinar because I had some time constraints. I really wanted to focus on how to use the transaction approval queue, not how to avoid it. But if you've seen all this and you think, oh, that's just way too much, you can use the NextGen reports to run reports of all those transactions that meet that criteria and review them separately. But it's kind of like closing the door after the horse is already out of the barn, because the transaction's already posted, committed, patients have started getting statements against it. So there are really a lot of reasons to do it this way. And there are good reports against the activity in the approval. So what I tried to do here was show you an example of the task approval report. It contains the columns that are typically necessary to just sort of make sure. And as with all NextGen reports, based on your column and your filter criteria in filter 1, you can look at all the things, where they are, and it has a handy little feature that tells you how long they've been out there. So luckily, this is our test database, and it looks like I've got some that have been out there for 1,000 days, because I've been playing around with this for a long time, but it will tell you how long it's been in my approval queue, waiting for someone. So you may have a threshold. You could run the report with filter 2, having a threshold of anything over 15 days. Maybe get to report to somebody to prompt the user to go ahead and do their approvals. So now I'm going to leave you to reflect back on what you think. How do you feel about using this accounting safeguard in your practice?
Perfect. Well, thanks, Dottie. Yeah, I know, we've covered a lot of information today. So I hope when you guys think about this question and reflect on this, that, all Dottie's hard work going through this process today was beneficial for you guys. You found it, taking you through that process, all the details that you could take this back to your practice and implement it. So hopefully, like I said, you found this informative. If you do feel a little bit overwhelmed because there was a ton of, really great information, let's look at some next steps and how Attentive can potentially help. We can assess your current situation and provide recommendations or assistance in getting you set up to use transaction approvals, or, really any other kind of next-gen functionality or practice operations or processes as well. So to get started, if you're thinking of ways to reach out to us, feel free to visit our website. Continue to sign up for our webinars. We do have some pretty great topics coming down the pipeline here during the summer as well as into the fall. And consider some of the services we offer, such as one of our on-site consultations. We have them for EHR, the clinical workflow, PM, looking at that revenue cycle and front office, and then also technology and performance, which these are basically an overall comprehensive assessment of current practice operations with recommendations and a nice long report here on where and how to improve on those. And of course, don't forget about our products here, ChartGuard and Refund Manager. We can test drive those as well. And like I said, of course, you can always reach out to us directly. And if we don't know the answer, we'll get you to the right place. Or if you're looking for a certain contact, you can always start here as well. But it looks like we have made it to questions. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I am actually going to go ahead and turn it back over to Chelsea for any questions those of you on the call may have. And hopefully Dottie and I can get those answered for you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Lindsay. And Dottie, thank you so much for making such a thorough webinar. So far, we only have 2 questions. I'm guessing that is entirely due to how truly thorough you went through all of that information. But if you have questions, like I said, we only have 2, so now is a great time to ask them. You can type them in the questions area of the webinar control panel, and we'll just go through them in the order that we received them. So first question, do you have to set up all 3 types, or can you just have adjustments?
You can pick and choose, really. You can just have adjustments. You can just have very high dollar adjustments. You can set up as many different adjustment types. Just make sure you don't want 2 approvals for one. So make sure if you're using 2 different adjustment tasks that you have different adjustment codes in those tasks. But you don't have to use the refunds or the payment ones that I showed you. You can just have adjustments.
Perfect, thank you, Dottie. Next question, can you put them all in one task?
You can put them all in one task. I typically don't recommend it because the task type is pretty beneficial to tell you what you're approving. But you could put all 3 in one task if you wanted to. Just check the adjustment, put your parameters, the payment, put your parameters, and the refund, put your parameters. NextGen is very flexible, sometimes too flexible.
Perfect, thank you, Dottie. Next question, can we get a copy of the slides? I can take that one. Yes, I will be sending out a copy of the slides along with a link to the recording within the next week here, so keep your eyes out for that. Sometimes that email gets caught in people's spam folders for some reason, so if you haven't received it, feel free to reach out to us and I'll make sure that, that I can send it to you in a different way so that you do receive it. Looks like that's all that we have. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Dottie, thank you for putting this all together. And I hope you have a great rest of your day and enjoy your week. And thank you for everything.
Thanks, you guys. Have a great day. Stay safe.